Currently, a significant number of Koreans have started to think that we should have nuclear weapons as well. Even if it's not about developing our own nuclear arms, there were quite a few opinions suggesting the redeployment of tactical nuclear weapons. According to a recent public opinion poll, when asked about redeploying US tactical nuclear weapons in our country, 75.1% of respondents said they were in favor. Among them, 17.2% responded that they were opposed. The percentage of people agreeing to redeploy tactical nuclear weapons turned out to be very high. What's more, it's interesting when you look at the age groups. We could see that the approval rate among people in their 20s and 30s was very high. In their 20s, 88.4% supported the redeployment of tactical nuclear weapons. In their 30s, 86.3% supported the redeployment of tactical nuclear weapons. The age group with the lowest approval rate was people in their 50s, but even among them, the approval rate was as high as 66.5%. In particular, public opinion was also very high regarding the development of our own nuclear weapons. When asked what response the government should prioritize, the most common answer was strengthening the US nuclear umbrella and missile defense capabilities at 36.3%, followed by developing our own nuclear weapons at 26.9%. Notably, 16.9% supported redeploying US tactical nuclear weapons. Public support for South Korea's nuclear armament has grown each year. A Korea Gallup poll in January 2024 found 72.8% in favor. The public support for nuclear armament, which was 56.5% in 2023, has recently reached the 70 to 80% range. Naturally, one of the biggest reasons for the growing support among Koreans for nuclear armament is North Korea. Currently, North Korea is known to possess between 60 and 150 nuclear weapons. Not stopping there, it is analyzed that North Korea is aiming to increase its nuclear arsenal by more than 300 within the next 10 years in order to secure a second strike capability that would allow it to retaliate with surviving nuclear forces even if attacked by the United States or South Korea. As the perception grows that North Korea's nuclear capabilities are continuously expanding, it is inevitable that public anxiety about national security among the South Korean public will also increase. North Korea has recently kept up military pressure on South Korea and the US by repeatedly launching ballistic missiles. In addition, as South Korea pushes forward with the development of nuclear-powered submarines, North Korea has even issued threats suggesting it could carry out retaliatory attacks at a level that would make survival impossible. When South Korea seeks new military capabilities, North Korea responds by referencing nuclear weapons. When this situation keeps repeating, the public can't help but question whether the issue of North Korea's nuclear weapons can really be resolved through diplomatic negotiations alone. However, there was an even more noteworthy result in this latest public opinion poll. South Korea is protected by the US nuclear umbrella, meaning the US would respond with overwhelming force, including nuclear weapons, if North Korea attacked South Korea with nuclear weapons. When asked about the US nuclear umbrella's effectiveness in a real war, opinions were evenly divided. If North Korea nukes South Korea, the US would likely retaliate with nuclear weapons, despite risking a nuclear attack itself. 41.8% of respondents said they believe so, while 41.7% said they do not. The difference was only 0.1 percentage points. The reason why the results are important is that the issue of whether or not to trust the US nuclear umbrella is being perceived by the Korean people as a real security concern. There are doubts the United States would retaliate with nuclear weapons if North Korea launched a nuclear attack on Seoul, even if it risked losing New York. If confidence in US defense of South Korea weakens, calls for securing our own deterrent against North Korea's nuclear threat will grow. That's why the survey found strong support for developing our own nuclear weapons. If more people feel that it's hard to fully trust the US nuclear umbrella, while North Korea continues to increase its nuclear weapons and threaten nuclear attacks, public opinion that we should have our own independent nuclear deterrent could become even stronger. Many believe that simply having nuclear forces ready to respond will deter North Korea from attacking, even if we never need to use them. So what do you think about nuclear armament? Please leave your thoughts in the comments. If we assume that South Korea chooses nuclear armament, there are mainly two directions to consider. One is developing our own nuclear weapons, which is independent nuclear armament, and the other is redeploying US tactical nuclear weapons on the Korean peninsula, which is tactical nuclear deployment. First, let's look at independent nuclear armament. Although South Korea does not possess nuclear weapons, it is regarded by the international community as a country with significant nuclear technology and industrial infrastructure. Therefore, among experts, there is an analysis that if South Korea makes a political decision, the time required to develop nuclear weapons could be shorter than that of other countries. There have also been related discussions at the Seoul National University Nuclear Policy Center, and considering realistic conditions, an analysis suggested that at least 15 to 18 months would be needed. When combining the evaluations of other experts, a period of about 18 to 55 months is being mentioned. However, since South Korea lacks the reprocessing facilities needed to develop nuclear weapons, technical and institutional challenges may occur during development. The issue is not so much the process of making nuclear weapons itself, but the reason behind it. The moment South Korea pursues independent nuclear armament, it is highly likely that it will be difficult to avoid conflict with the international community. As a nuclear non-proliferation treaty signatory, South Korea would directly conflict with the global non-proliferation regime if it pursued nuclear weapons. As a result, there is a possibility of diplomatic pressure and economic sanctions from the United States and other Western countries, and it is especially important to consider that China may strongly oppose as well. Given the strong economic ties between China and South Korea, China's response could heavily impact the domestic economy. Thus, independent nuclear armament cannot be judged solely by the technology and time required to acquire nuclear weapons. The public's ability to handle economic shocks, companies' resilience to sanctions and export limits, and the government's capacity to maintain its policy amid diplomatic isolation all become key variables. From the perspective of a regime pursuing nuclear armament, there can also be considerable political burdens. If the economy worsens and there are shocks in exports and the financial market, public support for the government could fall sharply. The most realistic burden is that the national economy could be shaken simply by pursuing nuclear armament. On the other hand, there are definitely military effects that come with independent nuclear armament. If Korea secures its own nuclear capabilities, we won't just have to wait for the US to respond to North Korea's nuclear attacks. We will have our own nuclear retaliation capability. This would create a different deterrence framework from the current one, where we have to wonder whether the United States would definitely retaliate with nuclear weapons if North Korea attacked South Korea. Nuclear-armed countries struggle to decide on full-scale attacks since each must consider the other's ability to retaliate. In fact, there have been cases of military clashes even between nuclear-armed countries, but it is assessed that simply possessing nuclear weapons itself has the effect of making it difficult for the other side to decide on a full-scale attack. Therefore, if South Korea possesses nuclear weapons, it is likely that North Korea would feel much more burdened when deciding to launch a large-scale attack against South Korea. Another key change is nuclear retaliation capability. If North Korea uses nuclear weapons and South Korea has its own, we could respond directly without waiting for the United States. This capability alone can help deter North Korea's nuclear attacks. However, the moment we pursue nuclear armament, the potential for economic shock and international isolation is also very high. So developing our own nuclear weapons would be a choice that requires us to bear military, economic, and diplomatic costs together. What about redeploying tactical nuclear weapons? The United States is updating its nuclear forces to offer flexible operational responses.
확대하려는 움직임을 보입니다.
Tactical nuclear weapons are being discussed as an option that can be used not only in situations of large-scale strategic nuclear war, but also in limited military conflicts, so it's an issue South Korea can't help but pay attention to. The United States once deployed tactical nuclear weapons in Korea. From 1958 to 1991, U.S. Forces Korea operated tactical nuclear weapons, deploying various types of U.S. nuclear forces on the Korean peninsula. As the Cold War ended, the George H.W. Bush administration withdrew overseas tactical nuclear weapons. The 1991 Joint Declaration on the Denuclearization of the Korean Peninsula led to the removal of all U.S. tactical nuclear weapons in Korea. The redeployment of tactical nuclear weapons differs from having our own arsenal as it involves returning nuclear forces that were previously on the Korean peninsula. If tactical nuclear weapons are redeployed, since South Korea would not be developing nuclear weapons on its own, there is the advantage of avoiding issues related to the NPT or conflicts with the international non-proliferation regime that could arise from developing its own nuclear weapons. Because South Korea wouldn't directly produce or possess nuclear weapons, it can also be pursued within the framework of the alliance with the United States. Compared to developing its own nuclear arsenal, this option may bring less diplomatic and economic strain. Still, redeploying tactical nuclear weapons presents tough challenges. The main concern is if the US is willing to use nuclear weapons. Even with US tactical nukes in South Korea, the US retains sole authority over their use. A separate question is whether the United States would retaliate with nuclear weapons if North Korea used them against South Korea. From the US perspective, the moment they respond with nuclear weapons to North Korea's nuclear attack, not only do they risk further nuclear attacks from North Korea, but even the US mainland could be exposed to the threat of nuclear attack. Therefore, just because tactical nuclear weapons are deployed in South Korea, it cannot be assumed that the United States will definitely carry out nuclear retaliation. For South Korea, this is the biggest source of anxiety. If North Korea launches a nuclear attack and the US hesitates to respond with nuclear weapons due to escalation fears, deploying tactical nuclear weapons in South Korea will still have limited deterrent effect. The main issue with redeploying tactical nuclear weapons is ensuring trust that the United States would use them in an emergency, not whether they're physically in South Korea. This is why, if we pursue the redeployment of tactical nuclear weapons, we must also discuss the conditions under which the United States would use nuclear weapons, the consultation procedures between South Korea and the United States, and issues of command and control.